Governments are always investing in progress. Things like new universities, groundbreaking scientific research, better roads. And these can be incredibly powerful investments. But what's the real cost when all that spending isn't funded by taxes, but by borrowing? Well, that's what we're going to dig into here, the hidden trade-offs of government debt.
And it often kicks off with some big, grand vision. Back in 1965, for example, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Higher Education Act, and he framed it as this absolutely crucial investment in America's human capital. The goal was incredibly noble, to swing the doors of college wide open for millions of people.
But of course, those great visions, they come with a hefty price tag. And this really gets at a fundamental economic reality. Ambitious projects often cost way more than a government is bringing in through taxes. So the question is, where does that extra money come from?
And that right there is the central question. And the answer? Well, it's kind of hiding in plain sight, inside an economy's basic financial rulebook.
Okay, so this rulebook, it's all built around something called the National Saving and Investment Identity. Now, don't let that long name scare you off. The idea behind it is actually super simple, and it is the key to unlocking this whole thing. So, at its heart, it's just an unbreakable rule of economics. All the money available for investment, the supply, has to perfectly match the total demand for that money.
Yeah, a good way to think about it is like a giant national balance sheet. On one side, you have all the sources of money, the supply, and on the other, all the places that money is going, the demand, and they absolutely must balance out. Period.
So where does this supply of money, or capital, actually come from? Imagine it's like a big lake that's fed by two streams. The first stream is private savings, all the money tucked away by regular households and by businesses. The second one, that's foreign investment, capital flowing into the country from all over the world, which tends to happen when a country imports more than it exports.
Okay, so that's the supply. But who's drinking from this lake? Who's demanding all that capital? Well, again, it's basically two main players. You've got private companies who are borrowing money to build new factories, develop new tech, and just generally grow. And then you have the government, which borrows money whenever it runs a budget deficit.
And here's the part you really got to remember. This is not just some economic theory, okay? It is a straight-up accounting reality. That scale has to balance. So if you pile more weight on one side, say government borrowing, something else has to change to keep things level. There's just no way around it.
All right, so now that we've got the blueprint, we can get to the real heart of the matter. What actually happens when the government's demand for capital, in other words, its borrowing, suddenly goes way up?
Right. If the government suddenly decides it wants a much bigger slice of the financial pie, that extra money has to come from somewhere. The economic equation must balance. So, what gives? What's got to change?
When you break it all down, there are really only three ways for the books to balance. First, people and companies could just save more money. Second, private companies could invest less. Or third, that extra money could start flowing in from other countries, which means the trade deficit gets bigger.
So let's take a look at that first possibility. Do people just save more? Well, there's a theory for this. It suggests that when rational people see the government borrowing a ton of money, they think, uh-oh, we're going to have to pay for this later with higher taxes. So they start saving more today to get ready. So it's a neat theory, right? But does it actually hold up in the real world? Well, not exactly. The data shows that for every single dollar the U.S. government borrows, private savings only go up by about 30 cents. So that leaves a 70-cent gap, and that money still has to come from somewhere else. And that brings us right to outcome number 2. This is a phenomenon economists have a name for. They call it crowding out. See, if private savings don't cover the gap, the government's heavy borrowing can act like a giant sponge, just soaking up the available money and leaving a lot less on the table for private companies to borrow and invest.
Let me break down how that works. When the government jumps into the market as a massive borrower, it drives up the total demand for capital. And basic economics tells us that when demand goes up, so does the price. In the world of finance, the price of money is the interest rate. So it gets more expensive for everyone, including all those private companies, to borrow and invest. Okay, so that leaves one last place to get the money, from outside the country. When foreign investors start sending their cash over to fund a government's budget deficit, it can lead to what's sometimes called the twin deficits phenomenon, where it looks like a budget deficit and a trade deficit are moving hand in hand.
But here's the thing. When you actually look at the data, the relationship isn't always a perfect one-to-one deal. Sure, the two deficits often rise and fall together, but there are plenty of times where they go their separate ways.
As one source put it, and I love this, they're often more like cousins than twins.
Okay, so those are the immediate trade-offs, the things that happen year to year. But the real dangers start to emerge when these deficits aren't just a temporary fix, but they become a chronic, long-term feature of the economy. What happens then?
And the long-term risks, they are absolutely significant. According to a Brookings Institution report, a pattern of these huge deficits can trigger a whole cascade of problems. A lower national savings rate, less money for private investment, and because of that, slower economic growth over the long run. It can also mean constant pressure for higher interest rates, the risk of sparking high inflation, and just creating a ton of uncertainty in financial markets all over the world. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. History is unfortunately littered with examples. From Mexico in '95 to East Asia in '97, Russia in '98, Argentina, Turkey in 2002. In all these cases, large and sustained government deficits played a huge role in setting the stage for some really severe financial crises once international investors started getting nervous.
So, after all this, what's the final verdict? Well, it's clear that government borrowing isn't simply good or bad. It's a really powerful tool, and using it always involves a series of unavoidable trade-offs.
I mean, on one hand, it can fund the exact kind of investments in education and infrastructure that we need to fuel growth for decades. But on the other hand, that unbreakable rule we talked about, the national saving and investment identity, it forces our hand. It makes us face the choice. That money has to come from somewhere, either from our own savings, from private investment that now won't happen, or from the rest of the world.
And this really leaves us with the fundamental challenge that sits at the very heart of all economic policy. How should a nation balance the urgent, pressing need to invest in its present against the critical, solemn duty to secure its economic future?